Welcome to the SDA Housing Podcast, brought to you by NDIS Property Australia. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
Hello everybody, my name is Minh and I'm your co-host with Debbie, and you're listening to the SDA Housing Podcast, a show that explains, highlights, guides and brings awareness about all things SDA in this ever-changing NDIS world. Debbie, welcome.
Hello, Minh.
Who have we got today as guests on our podcast?
We have Joshua from the office.
Hello.
And we also have Rohan.
Hello.
Welcome, Rohan.
Thank you.
Rohan is joining us as a first-time podcast speaker. Rohan is actually one of our sales consultants based down in Bowral, and he's come up to be with us in the office for a couple of weeks to just get on top of everything we're doing and understand a bit better what we do. So Rohan also was with us last week in Sydney at the SDA conference that we attended, which is what this episode's going to be about. We thought that Josh, Rohan and myself would just have a quick overview of who spoke at the conference, the topics and what we learned. So, welcome guys. Thanks for taking the time out today.
Thank you.
Rohan, what did you find new and interesting at the event there in Sydney?
I guess I'm very new to the whole NDIS system and SDA housing. So I guess the best way to start was to get thrown into a conference and really listen all day to all different people in regards to different sectors of the whole system and process. And what I found was that it's a very steep learning curve, and there's a lot of information out there. I thought I had a bit of an understanding about how NDIS works, but from what I've seen and heard, and I've been in the property industry for a long time, is there's so much miscommunication in regards to, procedures and policies and the actual facts of SDA housing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think also for Joshua, he's been with us a few months now and has certainly learned a lot in that time. I think you found it really useful as well, Josh?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the biggest takeaway that I had was that there's so many professions and so many facets that go into this investment and into this space, and I think that was what interested me the most. Yeah.
So to run through the different speakers there, we had about 6 different speakers on the day. We had a valuer. Myself also spoke. We had an insurance agent who specialises in SDA property insurance. We had Dan, who was one of our guest speakers from previous episodes from Everhomes. He had a couple of sessions during the day, and we also had an SDA assessor as well as an architect. So it was a different mix of speakers to the previous seminars and conferences that we've been to before. Really good day. I guess let's start with the valuers.
Yeah, so Rohan, the first speaker at the event was Nikaisa, and the guy was Craig, I believe his name was. One of the topics he covered was the risks in regards to investing in NDIS property. Rohan, you want to rehash what those were when you at the event?
Yeah, it was interesting to hear it from a valuer. One thing that I guess I've learnt is that, the big four or the traditional banks are struggling to value NDIS or SDA housing purely because it's got so much more in it. But the big thing that they did point out is that there's a lot of people out there, mum and dad investors who are, I don't want to say getting spruiked to, but getting introduced to NDIS housing, and, they're overpaying. They're paying way over what the existing price is. Now, whether that's due to, large commissions that these guys are getting or anything else, but The other thing is really it's a cash flow play. There is, a limited capital growth. You're buying an investment property that is in a smaller pool. So the demand for that is really the participants or the people moving into it. From an investment point of view, it's not the traditional house and land package where you've got such a huge market of people looking to buy opportunities. So, and being very educated. The other thing is the limited tenant demand. When they were doing their valuations, they were looking at the different types of tenants and the availability of those types of, tenants, from all the different ranges and needs, down to robust and, independent living and through that. The other thing is, depending on what you select in regards to a property and the valuation, and they use robust, for example, is that the property damage, and then also, looking at the different types of insurances to cover things, the way the property's got to be built, to be robust and just be a stronger home. The other thing is, I guess, nationally, property values are falling. The market's definitely stabilising out. Interest rates are going up and, we're in a slower market. So all these are conditions of what they take into place when they do a valuation. They look at the area, they look at the demand for the tenant, and this is a specific tenant, and they also look at how the property values are sitting. The big thing which I really connected to was, from a SIL point of view. So ultimately a SIL is really the person who's, getting you the participant or the tenant. If there's not a strong availability of SILs within that area or for that property, it just makes it hard to stack up from a valuation point of view. And they're probably the main points or key points that, Craig pushed out when he did his presentation, and it was a bit of an eye-opener for me as well. So it's not just, looking for an NDIS property in the middle, wherever it is. I think, you need to work with an organisation that understands, the demand, understands the need and that type of need, and can match that participant to that home. And, it was one thing that was very interesting.
And I think what I found interesting on the valuations side was that they said in general, valuations are still coming in pretty on par.
Yeah.
They're not coming in overvalued, which, considering these properties are a couple of $100,000 more than a standard property, is interesting. They are getting it right and they are valuing up.
Yeah. Yeah, it was very interesting. And,
yeah. So, and I guess that leads into, you talked about insurance. The next speaker was Julie from LHB Insurance, and she has been working in the field now for quite a few years now, dealing with NDIS property owners specifically and educating them on the need to have very specialised insurance, because this is not just a residential investment property you've got. So any takeaways from her?
Yeah, no, I thought the two most interesting things that I heard from Julie were discussing what makes something a business, what makes it a commercial property, and I thought that was really interesting just to hear about when it becomes a commercial property, how many tenants you can have until that becomes the case, and then also talking about what's malicious intent in terms of insurance. And, what's an accident, basically, what can happen to a house and what the different sort of disabilities mean for sort of damage that can happen to a house, and then how that's categorised further on.
Yeah, she spent a bit of time on the word malicious intent.
She did.
So what was the definition of malicious intent, and how does that apply to the policy, insurance policy?
It was basically that it had to be proven that it was a malicious behaviour by the tenant, which very much went into the conditions, the predisposed conditions that the tenant would come with. They might have behaviours that would potentially cause damage, but if that's part of their their diagnosis. It's not malicious.
Yeah, I think the example she used was a very good example in regards to, you might have a participant who suffers from a mental illness or anxiety or something like that. So, that participant, she said, might slam that door 100 times. So in that tenant or that person slamming that door, she or he is not slamming that door with the malicious intent of breaking that door. It's to release her anxiety. She said, the clarity on that in regards to when you're talking to an insurance broker who's talking to an insurance company on a claim is the difference between it getting through or not, or getting, it knocked back.
Yeah. So
but I thought that was very interesting, and it sort of gave a good definition of, the difference between malicious, they're not trying to break something or they've broken something with an intent to create damage, whereas it was to release the anxiety.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess this really hammers home the point that robust homes, I know a lot of people I speak to, you talk about robust homes and the potential tenants, and they do get concerned thinking that they're going to be up for higher maintenance costs, that sort of thing. Well, the whole point of building them robust is that you won't be up for higher maintenance costs because they're built to withstand this sort of treatment, I guess, by tenants. And that's why it's even more important when you are building robust homes, if at all possible, you are building it with particular tenants in mind. You know what their behaviours are, you know what their conditions are, so the property can be designed really with them in mind. But that's getting off the topic.
We digress.
We do. So back to the next speaker, who was Dan, good old Dan Ackfield from Everhomes. He had 2 sessions. He spoke firstly about the challenges relating to finding SDA participants. And the second session was regarding I guess value for money, participants' rights to share or not, and other issues regarding to the separation of SDA and SIL or care supports.
2 interesting facts he mentioned in Dan from Everhomes mentioned in his presentation was the fact that it takes 6 months to fill a single vacancy in the house.
On average.
On average, yeah. And then also the vacancy rate across Australia is 10 to 15%.
Yeah.
So they're an organisation that's expanded their service around Australia now, and we should take heed to their advice and their warnings that it takes time to fill up houses. And, a 4-bedroom house will always have probably 2 tenants. A 3-bedroom house will have 2 or 1 tenant. And what we're seeing a lot, Debbie, around Australia is, not around Australia, but definitely in South East Queensland, is a lot of 1-tenant houses, Debbie.
Yeah.
Where there's a cluster of houses being built in the area, and they are normally the lower socioeconomic areas where the land is cheaper. All the investors and builders are in that same area doing the same builds. Hence the reason why there'll be a lot of vacancies in the area, yeah.
Which makes it even more important to make sure that you're going to be building in the right area, which is really hard to do when there's no land available. So I want to reiterate this for any listeners out there. If you do have an existing property, whether it's got a house on it or not, and you think that this might be suitable for an SDA build, especially if it's in well-established locations, suburbs, it could be a really good opportunity to look at whether you can build an SDA property on it, because we are struggling with demand in a lot of areas.
Another statistic that Dan mentioned, which I didn't realise was the number, we all keep talking about 6.1% as the population of
SDA participants
in the NDIS population. It's not. Currently, it's 3.8%.
Yep. Yeah, currently.
So the forecast 15 years ago was 6.1%. Currently, it's 3.8%. Yeah.
So we still got a lot of participants need to join the cohort at the moment. A lot need to still go through that funding application.
So next, who was next speaker.
Was Jeremy Soden, who is an SDA assessor. He talked about the upcoming changes in the National Construction Code and the impacts this might have on SDA. So any takeaways from Jeremy's?
That was interesting how it's, the assessment of NDISDA or SDA housing is evolving. It's changed from what it was, 2 years ago, and he even mentioned some of the changes, that were happening 2 weeks ago, in regards to the classification of a villa and a duplex and just the different sides of things.
That was actually Anthony, I think.
Oh, that was Anthony.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, well.
Yeah,
sorry,
the
mate,
two
I got you
sessions kind
confused.
of did run in
Molded
together and had a similar theme.
Yeah.
But
But about that topic, Rohan, when Anthony spoke about how his work and the plans and designs for their projects, which are now obsolete because of NDIS interpretation, do you recall what he explained about that? The villa, one entry?
Yeah, like he did a couple of designs in regards to, I think it was called a villa, or he was calling them villas. And he said, well, now the classification is that it's not a villa anymore unless they have separate entries. So they, have to have completely separate entries. It can't be a side entrance down the side of a home into a smaller unit in the back or anything like that. So that was interesting. And, his frustration was having to go back and redesign and to get, I guess, approval.
this was specifically to New South Wales, which is where he's based.
Very much New South Wales.
And I guess this may also differ from state to state anyway, where in Queensland, I haven't seen any villas that have been basically a whole lot of independent units within one larger house, which is how he was describing these properties, really, wasn't
I
it?
think in Queensland they call it a dual key. So it has a main entrance with, an access down the side, and it's either through a sliding door into a smaller villa into the side of the home.
Let me explain my interpretation. I've seen it differently in Melbourne and Sydney. So, Debbie, we went to a Adapt Housing open home last week.
We did.
Yeah. How'd you find that one?
Fabulous. It was really good to actually see the property, which was what I imagined a villa is. And it was 3 individual villas side by side, all with their own individual entrance. So they were all attached under the one roof, but they had 3 separate entrances along the front. It was built in a very long and wide, a very wide block with a very short.
And they were 3 front entrances with 3 garage areas. So they were like side by side small houses.
Yeah.
Yes.
Kind of like a terrace house, yeah.
Now, these villas he refers to were 1 roof, 1 long house, 1 entrance, and a long corridor with smaller apartments side by side in that corridor, like a boarding house.
Yeah.
Now, that's their version in Sydney of a villa, but the NDIA interpretation now is it's now a house unless it has multiple entrances. So that's what's changed. That was only changed a few days earlier.
Yeah. So I guess this just highlights the importance of really getting it right first up and how complicated this is for everybody. In fact, Anthony, who was telling us this, was one of the original architects, if you like, of the SDA design guidelines. And if he doesn't know what they really mean, then it just shows you how complex this whole thing is. And everyone is still trying to learn it. My takeaway from that was that keep it simple, build a house or build a unit or build a distinct separate villa, a series of villas. But I guess, things are still changing, and it's so important to go to these events for us to talk to different people, learn new things. That was what I got out of it, really.
And I guess leading back into Jeremy, because I changed the subject, but he sort of goes in afterwards, and it was interesting to see the different types. He showed us a lot of photos and films of, houses that are SDA approved, but he goes in there, but the PowerPoints are in the wrong position, or, even the handles and the door handles are incorrect, or the taps are incorrect, or, there's no access for a wheelchair to fit under the sink, for example, or if they do fit under the sink, they can't reach, the handle. And these have been approved houses. So it's, there's builders and builders out there, I guess. And
assessors and assessors as well.
Because the last thing you want is an NDS house that no one wants to live in.
Yeah, yeah. So even if it does meet the guidelines, doesn't mean that it's going to be a good house.
Yeah.
So, it was an interesting couple of sessions, in fact. So, Josh, what about your takeaways from...
Yeah, I just thought it was incredible to listen to how many things you wouldn't even notice go into making your house NDIS, compliant. So just, the little raises from your step to your doorway. I thought that, you wouldn't even think about that when you walk into a place, and then just how much of a difference that might make. So that's what I really took that away from Jeremy's speech. He also spoke about how there was the Liverpool housing design standards that were coming in, or something to that effect. He said it wouldn't have a massive impact on NDIS, but what it would do is it'd be a great marketing tool for disability housing in general, and those changes will really make people, think about what goes into building a disability home.
Minh, any more last takeaways?
Not really. I mean, it was always good to see more speakers, different content. We also talked about the NCC, the National Construction Code. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that was Jeremy's.
Yeah, and how it's not exactly the improvability standard, but it's close to.
Yeah.
And Jeremy said the cost to actually make it a improvability equivalent is probably $5,000, $10,000. That's all there is. That's what he mentioned.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. So from the National Construction Code
changes, which doesn't apply to New South Wales or WA, but everywhere else.
It's another $5,000 on top of what it will now cost to build a home to make it improve livability. SDA.
But he did say he doubts that many builders will actually do that extra. They'll actually will charge a lot more to do that than saying it's only $5,000 more. So he said his words were, I doubt we'll get many builders doing that upgrade of $5,000. No.
Yeah. And remember, most people are building high physical support, so that's kind of relevant anyway, because there are so many more guidelines and construction changes that will make a house wheelchair friendly over this.
Deb, Dan did throw some numbers about percentages for HPS, FA and ILs and robust. Yeah,
Dan said that, and I believe this is what they're seeing with their participants, their clients, 38%, 35 or 38% are high physical support.
Now, that's him quoting what his business is attracting. Obviously, when you are only representing HPS houses everywhere, think about this for a second. If you are a provider and you're only advertising HPS houses, you're only going to get HPS people. Yeah. So think about that for a second. So that's why his numbers are 38%. I mean, I've written in my notes here from what the valuer mentioned. He said participants don't like change. And there are, of the 19,300 participants who are SDA funded, 47% are intellectual, 11% are cerebral palsy, 10% are autism. That is already 68%. Okay. 8% is next, unacquired brain injury, 7% Down syndrome. So 7 plus 68 is now 75. So the IL numbers are definitely over 70%. Psychosocial is 4%, strokes 3%, MS 2%, spinal cord 2%, other physical 2%. Okay. So they are the stats issued by the government with regard to the number of people who are SDA funded as per those disabilities. Every provider in different regions around Australia will have different numbers because they are only attracting a certain percentage.
They specialise in a particular type of client.
Like Anthony, the architect, he only specialises in robust only. Okay, so I'm sure that all his projects he's rolling out are all robust specific. So we'll see a different category of intake coming in. So, I don't doubt that Everhome's numbers are 38%, as you say, HBS, but overall across the country, it's not exactly 30% everywhere, no.
Yeah. So anyway, it was a great day. We had a networking function afterwards. A few more people came along too from within the industry in Sydney. And it was really worth going, I think. Josh, you got a lot out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I met a lot of providers actually, and that was a really good side to see of this whole process. So I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
It was nice to meet some people in the space.
Deb, we have coming up in June the Melbourne conference.
We do.
The 7th of July?
7th of June.
June. And then in August is the Brisbane conference on the 4th of August. Mm-hmm. So there'll be another one in Hobart.
There's one coming up in Perth. There's Hobart. There is South Australia, Adelaide.
Yep.
Yeah, there's quite a few still coming up. So we'll be at them all this year. So lots more speakers to meet and listen to, which is going to be great.
But Rohan, as a first-time attendee, any final words of advice from you to other investors or other providers or builders, developers who may be listening to this podcast? What are your thoughts on recommending to them to come along or not? Yeah,
I think it's definitely worth coming along. The sharing of information was, I guess, refreshing to see. I think the investment industry, which is where I've been back, everyone sort of hides from everyone and doesn't tell them, and they hold everything, all their aces to their chest and everything else. So it was good to have an open forum with everyone talking and communicating and really assisting, I guess, each other to sort of move forward in this sector. But one thing I guess I got out of the whole lot, and Minh mentioned, is, SDA housing has a higher vacancy rate than a traditional investment. The returns are a lot stronger and a lot better. But one thing I got out of it is that the tenant or the participant has a large choice of properties to select where they're going to live from. So in property selection, you've got to make sure, and maybe it'll cost you a little bit better, but it's got to be livable. It's not just something that's ticking off a box and ending up being a box, because you'll have a vacancy. You won't have a tenant. You'll have to look for other opportunities. So be very careful in the selection of your property, and because it'll make a big difference at the end of the day.
Yep. And come along to these seminars and these conferences, because you will learn so much.
So much. I learnt in a day what I couldn't put together in months of just reading and trying to understand. So it's a very strong network, and I recommend anyone should go.
For sure. Well, I think that just about wraps it up. So thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
See you on the next one.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed and following us so you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this podcast with those that could benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.